All right, everybody. It's time for everyone's favorite show of the week, Medieval Monday, with me, Cody Vibes. Wow, yay! Oh, please, you're too kind. Hit the theme song!
Presenting your host, Cody Vibes.
Whoa, okay, great theme song. Thank you, Odd But Fair. Long time channel viewer, maybe our biggest fan. Just kidding. I know some of you out there are really rabid supporters of the channel. I appreciate it. I know you're all watching Medieval Monday because that's just the place to be. Don't tell the other shows, but this one's my favorite, and I mean that this time. Okay, so what are we doing today on Medieval Monday? I hear you asking. Great question. It will be answered right now after this sponsor. Just kidding. We don't have sponsors. Today on Medieval Monday, we're going over the Battle of Bouvines again. Woo! I hear you. I hear everybody cheering for like the fourth episode on the Battle of Bouvines. I'm just kidding. It's the third. But we all know that. Because this is everyone's most cherished, favorite YouTube show on the fastest growing channel on this platform. And I can hear you saying, Cody, why are you stalling? Get right into it. I'm so excited to hear more about the Battle of Bouvines from what's today's account? Who's talking about it today? I'm glad you asked. Today's account of the Battle of Bouvines is the Anonymous of Bethune. Ooh, Anonymous of Bethune. This account is from a longer piece that was released in 1220, from what I understand, that encapsulates a big portion of French history. Anonymous of Bethune, I think, also wrote a longer history book after this one. And I think that this book this book, at least according to the source that I found on the internet, this primary source document says that it was written for Robert of Bethune. And a little interesting thing about this kind of perspective is that the French sort of land during this period of time was divided between French principalities and English principalities because King John of England was related to somebody de Aquitaine, which means that all of their land from France, I think, was basically owned by John, owned by England, and Bethune is an interesting province in that it's connected to the French mainland, but at the time of this battle, it was actually lorded over by the English. I believe that Bethune's is in the province of Flanders. And keep in mind, again, we've been over this time and time again, but I can never stress it enough. I'm not a historian. Any of this information could be wrong. I'm doing my best. I hope all of it's correct, but might be worth looking into, hearing all this. But this is all to say, the Anonymous of Bethune's, by the time of this battle, Flanders was part of the English-owned lands in France. By the time of at least 1223, Flanders was part of the French kingdom, French land openly. So it's an interesting kind of mixture of perspective here, in the sense that this accounting is done from someone who both lives in France and probably believes more or less in the larger French project. But at the time, they were obviously living under English rule and lordship. It's just a fun little complication to this whole thing. I know when I originally started reading it, this source for this week, I actually thought that this person was like purely on the side of the French, only to find out that Robert de Bethune actually gets captured in this battle by the French. So, spoilers! Should I start saying spoilers in front of all these videos, just in case someone doesn't know the history and is waiting for the movie to come out? Anyway, that's all the context that I currently really have to say that I find interesting about this recounting of the Battle of Bouvines. Without further ado, let's get into it. Let's do that thing you've all been waiting for me to do and review this primary source. So let's look at our first quote here. And I'm using my computer, partially because I just want to lord it over all the people who lived in the Middle Ages who didn't have computers. Must have sucked. Okay, so here we go. Here's our first quote. These are the names of the high men who went to battle with the King of France. Eudes, Duke of Burgundy, Henry, Count of Bar, Henry, Count of Grandpré, John, Count of Beaumont, Gauthier of Chatillon, Count of Saint Pol, William, Count of Ponthieu, Annual, Count of Guines, Raoul, Count of Sois. I mean, you get it. And many other great men too numerous to name. I think we already did too much naming, actually. This first quote is really just an accounting of all the people who were riding with King Philip before this battle starts. And what's really interesting and why I wanted to bring this into it and kind of begin this whole looking at this account with this is because this account also is a lot more interested in the depiction of battle, the depiction of these knights. The first account that we looked at really was just more about like a kind of general recounting of big parts of the battle. This account really gets into a little bit more granularly the fighting, who was involved, and how everything kind of happens. This account is also a lot more even keel tonally. It's not going to be nearly as exaggerated as the Marchiennes account. That's just something that we need to establish right off the bat. And the important part, I think, about getting this sense of all of these people who are involved with this battle is, one, I'm pretty sure, I don't think that this is actually within a hagiography. Like, I don't think that this accounting is done for a hagiography. I believe that the history that the Anonymous de Bethunes recorded was kind of for the honor of Robert de Bethune, but I don't think that this is necessarily a pure hagiography. Nonetheless, this account would have been printed within several years of the Battle of Bouvines, which means that all of these names could potentially still be in play as people who are living in 1220. And the interesting part, I think, about this is the way that this, I feel like, is probably part of the way that several of these personages made their reputation more pronounced across the land, is being involved in accounts like this. And especially for our intents here, these people are specifically involved on the side of the King of France, who did win the battle. I just think it's notable in that people who, and I don't think reading was really widespread, so this is really just a way, to a certain extent, for French nobility to read about themselves and, pat themselves on the back. But it also could be just a recounting of, who's on whose sides here. As I said, the context of this is that it all happens with French lands that are kind of in English hands. This really also establishes a long-running history of who's on whose side and the sort of way that these regions all play either to the French side of this conflict or the English side of this conflict. And then the other main thing that you really need to recognize with warfare at this time, we see a bunch of counts and everything listed at the beginning of this battle. Medieval warfare was incredibly expensive. Horses, armor, weapons, as well as people to fight alongside you, people to bear some of the equipment and everything like that. So it's really notable that all these people are listed here, right? And they're all counts or dukes. There are a couple dukes listed here. And it should just be understood generally that anybody who is really a big military person in this period of time, had land to their name, had money to their name. And this is actually, like, I find it really interesting. I think that there's, like, a way that you could read all of this as sort of preventing lower classes from really being able to establish themselves in the battlefield and being, like, useful as soldiers and everything like that, in essence, to add honor to the name of people who already had wealth and could afford to be a medieval knight. Honor doesn't trickle down if you can't buy a horse, essentially, here. So that's our first quote. Let's go to quote number 2. Quote number 2. The King of France went to his town in Tournai, while the Emperor, along with a Castellan, Everard Raoul, Castellan of Tournai, which he held from Count Ferrand, went to Mortagne. When the King of France heard that they were so near him, he became worried, as Mortagne was only 3 miles from Tournai. Then he called his great men and concluded in council that they would go towards France the next day. So we're actually understanding this story through the perspective of the French king here, of King Philip, despite the fact that the Bouvines of the actual time of this battle was opposed to the French, aristocracy and the French rule at the time, even if just because that's where they kind of lived, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But here we get a recounting of where the French king was before the battle, where the emperor was before the battle, and this I think it paints a little bit more detail than the account of Marchians. The account de Marchians kind of make it seem like Otto is just chasing Philip through the French countryside. This, I think, paints a different picture, where we see King Philip staying at Tournai when he happens to kind of coincidentally hear that the emperor is staying about 2 mills or 3 mills. Is that miles? That can't be miles, right? Anyway, he figures out that the emperor is staying 3 mills from where he's staying in Tournai. This account doesn't really say if it was Philip's intention to get this close to Otto or to repel his, like, sort of invasion. From what I understand, Otto and King John were working together to try to reclaim a bunch of lands in northern France here. So I think it's really reasonable to assume that King Philip heard about this, and then he started putting a coalition together and meant to ride at Otto. But here we get the picture that he landed way closer than he thought he was going to, and that's why he called council, right? And the other thing that I think is something of note here is the way that his council concludes that it would be best to go towards France the next day. This was a decision made by King Philip and a group of people here. So it's not like King Philip is depicted as someone who is, like, single-handedly making every decision. He was advised here that he should head back towards France. Clearly, the implication here is that he found himself accidentally just, like, very close to the front lines of where Otto was staying, and that when he and his, like, commanding sort of counts and barons heard this, they decided, let's try to make some distance between us and the people who are ostensibly trying to rid us from the lands. That's quote 2. Let's move into quote 3. When the next day came, the king had all his men arm themselves and his echelons put in formation. He thus left Tournai, and when the emperor and Count Ferrand and the people who were at Mortagne found this out, what did they do? They climbed in full armor on their horses and rode at breakneck speed after them so as to catch up with their prey. They reached the Duke of Burgundy and the Champenois, who made up the rear guard in a small wood 2 miles away from Tournai, and pressed them so hard that they had to stop and turn toward them, and had their bowmen shoot as to make their men, the assailants, retreat. The Flemings forced the rearguard to stop 5 times on this day and turned towards them so that the Duke of Burgundy sent a message asking the king to ride slowly as they were much pressed. All right, so this third quote is our introduction to the beginning of the battle, and it marks a major point of difference actually not a major point in difference between this and the account of Marchians, but a slight discrepancy. If we remember the account of Marchians, that account ends up saying that Otto rode at King Philip like an enraged dog and chased him for about 2 miles. Similar to this, so, there's a similarity, but it's definitely described much differently. In this version, we actually see the kind of warfare engaged. This is really interesting. I still don't know too much about the way medieval echelons or medieval military processions work. What we see here, though, is a sort of description of this rear guard is at the back of the pack in regards to French riding away from Tournai. We still get this sense that Otto and the Count of Ferrand heard that Philip was leaving Tournai and decided to chase him. This is, there is a similarity here where they rode at breakneck speed. I find the description of trying to catch up with their prey to be kind of animalistic in a similar way that the account of Marchians described them, but obviously this account, there's a lot less like foam at the mouth from Emperor Otto here, and we get a better idea of sort of how the French end up slowing down their procession. And the next, I think, quote is really going to be about, when they actually stopped. We get a sense of the initial part of this battle actually somewhat being fought during a ride. This is the ride away from Tournai, and for Otto and the Flemings here, this is it's chasing down King Philip. So I also think that part of what's interesting about this is the way that we get a little bit of a sense about how communication happened within these ranks, right? Seeing that the rear guard was being attacked and had to stop numerous times, the Duke of Burgundy actually sends somebody to ask the king to ride a little bit more slowly. Just an interesting aspect to warfare and communication back in medieval 1214 France here. I find the use of the 2 miles interesting. I need to figure out what miles was. Were miles a thing back in the day? Here we go. Quote 4. Brother Guerin came to the king at a church called Bouvines near Sion, where the queen had once visited. He found him off his horse at a place where he had refreshed himself with bread and wine. He asked him, "What are you doing?" "Well," said the king, "I have eaten." "That is good," said Brother Guerin, "and now you need to arm yourself, because those on the opposite side do not on any account want to postpone the battle till tomorrow, but they want it now. Thus you must do likewise." This quote is I'm going to continue to be fascinated by the sympathies that this account has and the perspective that it shares, because Robert Bethune at this moment was with the other side, right? He was not with King Philip here. This history was apparently somewhat dedicated to Bethune, but this is not at all what he would have experienced at this battle. He would have been on the other side. He would have been with Otto. He would have been discussing, the conversation about whether they should continue to fight the French right now. This perspective is on Philip's perspective, or at least the Brother Guerin's perspective, which is, on the French side. And part of why I wanted to include this is because I just think it's funny that somebody's, coming to tell the king that he has to go to battle, and they started off with, "What are you doing?" "Oh, well, I have eaten." "Oh, that's good." I think the dialogue is fun. A little bit of medieval dialogue. I think they're doing a great job. Yeah, what we see here is in the account, again, Philip is having his hands forced here. The other side has decided to fight, so I guess Philip has to fight now as well. Philip hasn't even said whether or not he wants to fight here. Like, we know that he doesn't, but the fact that this brother Guerin came and just walked up to the king, he was like, "Oh, it's good you eat, and now you gotta fight." If I were the king, I'd be like, "Don't tell me what to do. Who are you to me?" This is how Philip decides that he needs to fight, because someone from his forces comes up to him and tells him that the other side has decided, like, this is a fight, it's happening, eat beforehand, show up with a full stomach, here we go. That's sort of how King Philip is told that he's fighting on the day. Which brings us to quote 5. It was Sunday, and because of this, the king would have preferred the battle to be postponed till the morrow for the honor of the day. But when he saw that there was no other way, he put on his armor, entered the church, made his orisons, and was soon finished praying. Then he climbed on his horse and did not appear frightened any more, as he decided and ordered his affairs very wisely and assuredly without any panic, and had everyone, knights and others, called to return to their battalions. The host had already passed a bridge spanning a small river, and several pavilions had already been set up upon the other side of the bridge in a meadow where the king had planned to spend the night. Couple things about this quote. Starting off with, this establishes the Sunday, it being Sunday, and that being why the king would have preferred for the battle to happen the day after, but unfortunately, Otto, as we discussed in the previous quote, was forcing Philip's hands, or at least Otto's side was. There is going to be a larger discussion about who actually wanted to fight today later when we go over an account that's actually sympathetic to Otto and written from that perspective more so. But here, like we saw with the Marchian's account, he entered the church, he made his prayers, and I think it's notable that we see that he's described as not being frightened anymore, as if to imply that when he was told that he needed to fight, that he was scared. I just think that relative to sort of how especially modern day people view masculinity and being afraid and being frightened, I find it interesting that he was described as having been frightened, but obviously it seems like he had a little conversation with God, and he's not so worried anymore. So, and from that point on, he continues to sort of uphold this sort of stoic characterization, right? This stoic characterization where he's, very wisely and assuredly ordering various people to do various things. The account definitely makes an emphasis of, again, Philip's wideness. Philip's wideness. Ooh. No, it does not call Philip wide, but it does call him wise, and it brings attention to, his wisdom and how assured he was in fighting. Again, this is a guy who had, I think was in the Third Crusade, right? The other account from Marchiennes, another little discrepancy here is like that account had him crying as he was talking to his soldiers. Not in this account. Nope. He gets out of the church and he's like, you go there. Get into your battalions. And then the last little piece of detail here is that the host had already passed a bridge spanning a small river, and several pavilions had been set up. This means that, Bouvines was an encampment. The fight happens here, and the fight would, if they meant to fight, today or tomorrow, the fight still probably would have happened here. The French had already established this whole camp, and I think it also speaks to a certain strategic advantage the French would likely have at this point, what with everything being established, having ease of access to gear, the land itself, and it just seems to me like they're in a much more fortified position than Otto and his side is necessarily. So I just think that that's an interesting little detail here, that they already had all their camp stuff set up. I also find it fascinating because let's look at like a little bit of timeline of events, right? Obviously the night before, Philip hears that Otto is nearby, so they make the decision to ride out in the morning. They ride out in the morning to be, shortly kind of chased down by Otto. Then, because Otto starts attacking the rear guard, they're alerted to the fact that they need to slow down. And I guess it's between there, like that point, them slowing down and having established camp and, Philip eating lunch, that they actually begin to prep for the battle. So this happens after lunch, and that's all I know. But also, after lunch was apparently close enough to the nighttime where they had all of their things set up, according to this account. So it's just there's a lot of little things I think that this quote shares that are interesting in regards to sort of the bigger picture of this battle. So without further ado, though, let's go to quote 6. Thus the king had his echelons put in formation, and they rode forward. You could see among them many noblemen, much rich armor, and many noble banners. Same was true for the opposite side, but I must tell you that they did not ride as well, and in as orderly a manner as the French, and they became aware of it. So this little segment right here, first of all, we see a much less dramatic contrast between the two sides here, in that they both had many great noblemen, they both had much rich armor, they both had many noble banners. Both sides are given at least the credit of, dignity here, which you could not say the same for the Marchiennes account. I think part of this is probably because, as we established in the context, the association that this account has, right? It's not going to be, so overly antagonistic of English desires and forces here, in the sense that part of who this history is dedicated to was fighting on the English side in this conflict. Nonetheless, the person who's writing it, by the point of actually releasing it to the world, would have been living under French rule, and so there's definitely a felt need for this person to kind of do a both sidesy thing here. And but nonetheless, right, you can still tell that this is clearly somewhat more so, leaning towards the French superiority here, in that, the description of how the Flemings didn't ride as well or in as orderly of a manner as the French. The other account, kind of, the Marchiennes account, set up this contrast between who was on the side of wickedness and who was on the side of God, necessarily. For this account, I think there's more of an emphasis on the French riding better, the Flemings not having as orderly a manner, and obviously with kind of the encampment stuff prior to this quote, we can kind of tell through a more practical, concrete military sense the advantage that the French had in this particular conflict. So let's go into quote 7. Quote 7, as the host had come close enough to see each other clearly, they stopped for a long time and put their affairs in order. Then the king asked for an echelon of mounted sergeants who were all carrying pennants at the tips of their sword to assemble, and they did. They attacked the Flemings and performed many great deeds. This is the big start of the real battle. Similar to the Marchiennes account, there is a period of time where each side doesn't fight each other so that they can take care of their affairs. This, I think, speaks a little bit to the customs and etiquette of medieval chivalry and battle, because this is the other thing about this, right, that I kind of find impressive is, despite both of these sides, clearly they're going to try to kill and maim each other to a certain extent. We're going to get into the practice of knight ransoming a little bit later in the quotes here, because that's really significant for understanding the fallout of this battle, especially for King John of England. It's not like Otto approached Philip from behind and immediately began, full force attacking him. Both sides were given time to, mount defensive measures, put their affairs in orders, get their sergeants where they need to be, have echelons properly placed, I think is very, very noble in a way. I think also sort of talking to a level of like aristocratic, as we established earlier, a bunch of these like the class of knights, if we're going to put it that way, is largely dominated by, I'm going to say oligarchical forces, right? But it's like monarchies and people who are like very elevated by, this kind of caste system in the Middle Ages. They're the ones who are really in charge of the battle, and I do just find it very interesting that there's definitely a level of conduct that you still feel, on the battlefield here. So, and then obviously, towards the end of this passage, in the quote, they attacked the Flemings and performed many great deeds. This is in no way dissimilar from how a bunch of military conflicts that we experience in the modern age are framed as, the battlefield being a place of heroism, right? And there's certainly no less respect that these counts will have for the deeds of knights. So this brings us to our Great Deeds bonus round. Battle of Bouvines, Great Deeds bonus rounds. Here we go. Arnul, Castellan of Ross, let his horse loose between two lines and charged their bowmen, sending them running and throwing one to the ground. He then charged the knights, and in his drive threw rudely to the ground a bachelor named Michel of Occy, and kept on going through, then came back safe and sound to his people, where he was much praised. Epic. Sick. Guy loosed his horse and ran between two lines. Is there cooler stuff than that in the world? I don't know. I haven't experienced it yet. Great Deeds bonus round, number 2. Then the Count of Flanders charged the Champenois, and the Champenois charged him, but there was a heated melee. But the Champenois had to retreat. Oh, yeah, that's right. Love a heated melee. Love the Champenois retreating. Little thing of note, I won't talk about it too much, but the Count of Flanders is, again, he's fighting for the English here. So, this is another instance of, even in the Great Deeds section, the account is a lot more equitable to English forces here, but obviously this is the Great Deeds bonus round. You're not here to listen to me talk about historical context. Great Deeds bonus round number 3, our final Great Deeds bonus round. Then the armies from both sides charged each other, and there was a melee. The king's trumpet sounded because he himself had been hit. His horse fell under him, but he was soon up again. On this day his banner was carried by Galon of Montigny, a knight from Vermandois, who carried it very gallantly. Ooh, yeah, I love the king's trumpet in there. I love the armies charging each other. It's just good it's good night on night combat fighting. Whoa, you love to see it. I mean, it's vicious and brutal, and I'm sure thousands were maimed, but it's, hey, you gotta have fun sometime, I guess. But anyway, so that was the fun Great Deeds bonus round. I hope you enjoyed some of the talk of medieval combat. There will be more in other accounts because, boy oh boy, there are more accounts of this battle, but we'll talk about that later. For now, let's move on to quote 8. Quote 8. When Count Ferrand was taken, the Flemings started to tremble, and one after another began to take flight. Seeing this, the valorous men of France charged the battalion and gave grief to the Flemings and the Emperor's men, even though these included many a noble baron. So this is where we really see the turn of the battle. In the Marchiennes account, this turn happened seemingly a lot sooner, and we didn't really understand what necessarily caused it. I'm kind of blanking on exactly what the Marchiennes account said of the turning back of the battle. The Marchiennes account, I think, actually said that it was after this sort of first rush that the French engaged in, the first sweep that the French echelons did that caused the Flemings to immediately kind of begin to back off, which led to the battle lasting less than an hour. Here we see the main cause of retreat being this capture of the Count of Ferrand. The capture portion is something that we're going to be talking about in the next quotes to come, but just, be ready to talk about the fact that this count was captured. He wasn't killed. This will come to kind of represent what real victory on the battlefield for this point in time look like. The Flemish forces, according to the anonymous de Bethunes, I'm sorry, my tongue is tied. But to this account, the reason why the Flemings began to retreat was because people like the Count of Ferrand began being captured. And this ultimately, according to this account, adds more kind of fuel to the fire for the French forces, who then begin to really kind of charge the battalion and seriously cause some damages for the barons of the Flemish forces here. And even when these men are retreating, even when the emperor's men are retreating, the account makes sure that you understand that there are many noble baron included in Otto's forces, especially, for example, Robert de Bethunes, who might have been the most noble. He might have been the most noble baron. What's interesting about this account, and I know I've said it a couple of times now, is the way that his allegiances are really kind of torn here, right? Because you can't go and describe all of the emperor's men as wicked and awful and evil when it's one of those guys is the person you're writing this for. So, this is I think an example of this account. Part of its, impartialness. I think this account is really interesting in that I believe this sort of, looking at both sides equally probably gives us a better recount of this battle. But I also just find it to be fascinating in regards to how we perceive history. When you have the Marchiennes account, whose entire bend is a sort of religious argument, then you see an account like this whose loyalties are kind of conflicted. You get a larger sense of how people throughout history understand particular moments. For this particular account, this battle is by and large done between two somewhat well-intentioned sides that, despite the French clearly being a military superiority here, neither side necessarily deserves condemnation, and especially the losing side here doesn't deserve condemnation, and this account certainly is not dancing on the loss of the Flemish here, unlike the other account, which essentially praised God for his glory for letting King Philip win. But anyway, let's move on to quote 9. Quote 9. What more can I tell you? The Emperor's men and those of Count Ferrand were completely defeated. Count Ferrand himself was taken, as I told you, with many great men from his land. Helens of Waverin, the Seneschal of Flanders, a fairly new knight, was taken. The 3 sons of Racin of Gower, the Baudelaire of Flanders. Robert of Bethune was taken, but offered so much to a knight called Fleming of Crepelaine that he freed him and brought him back to safety. This is, sort of telling us how many of the Emperor's men were taken. Count Ferrand is the one that gets the most smoke here. And also the people of Flanders, right? And that's because Flanders was essentially where they were fighting. If it wasn't if Bouvines wasn't located within Flanders, it was right next to Flanders, basically. I don't know how much the Count of Ferrand necessarily was overseeing Flanders. That's just a limit in regards to what I know here. But yeah, a bunch of what is listed in this particular part of who King Philip captured really ties it back to the land of Flanders, which is, again, one of these lands that was under English lordship and within the capture of all of these, people who were, again, kind of described as, both sides having great barons, the practice of ransoming prisoners during medieval history was very common. And for the victor here, being King Philip, to get a number of your enemy's knights or barons or counts, that's, a real representation for how much you can charge these kingdoms and these families to get their people back, right? So when you're looking at victories, especially during this time period, military victories, a lot of actually how to understand, the rewards that are received at the end of them. Getting prisoners, capturing knights, capturing counts, capturing barons goes a very long way. And the fact that this account was able to list so many people, and there are more people that I just didn't include because it would make the quote go on longer than it already is. These are all people who you're going to get a serious penny for. So, and this is also partially why this defeat was really embarrassing for King John, because if a bunch of these people are, lords on the side of the English here, and you have to pay to get them back, for your barons back home, because this is part of why people didn't like him very much, is the way that King John throughout his lordship needed to continue to raise taxes in order to kind of make up for these military defeats. This passage is incredibly damning for King John, but it's also incredibly uplifting for King Philip. And then towards the end, obviously, we have Robert of Bethune, who is obviously described as being taken, but then was able to offer so much that he was freed and brought back to safety. There is a level, I think, of this presentation of wealth here. He actually had enough on his person to free himself and, get brought back to safety without necessarily having to bankrupt any kingdoms. And I think the fact that he uses his own wealth to free himself probably speaks well to, people of the age, right? And like I said, part of the big problem with losing this battle is hiking taxes on barons to make up for the loss of all these counts and barons. So I think it's definitely meant to be somewhat noble that Robert of Bethune, despite being taken, was actually able to pay his own way back to safety. So let's move on to the next quote. Quote 10. Arnul of Audenarde, who was Flemish, was also taken, but the king soon turned him over to the Count of Soissons. In the evening, the Duke of Burgundy mentioned this and said to the king, "You have the right to ransom him, because if it were not for him, you would have 200 more knights in your prisons." And the king answered the Duke, "Duke of Burgundy, I am well aware of this, but he never did like war, and he always advised his lord against it. He has never wanted to do homage to the King of England when the others did so. If he has done me wrong in order to loyally serve his lord, I hold no ill will toward him on that account." Thus, the king did honor Arnul of Audenarde. So I wanted to include this in here just so we could get this, again, this sense of how important ransoming people off in this period of time was. And I think the main way that we really get to see that is in how the Duke of Burgundy challenges the king, right? Who decides that Arnul of Audenarde is really not worth ransoming here and charging the Count of Soissons of, however many hundreds of dollars or, whatever they were, whatever currency they were using at the time. Not a historian. Remember when we talked about that? The fact that he could have gotten so much for the young Arnul, but chose not to, right? And this becomes a major point of contention, and this should speak to how regular and how important, honestly, at least for these people, for the royalty and for the knight class, during this period of time, it was very important to get these high-profile prisoners, and then it was very important to sell them back to the people where they came from. You could raise a substantial amount of money, particularly here right? The fact that Arnul basically costs the French kingdom 200 more knights. That's basically acknowledging that, if they had these 200 more knights, then they would be able to reap a lot more of the benefits, they would have more people to ransom. And for, politics sort of during this time period, that's really significant. And right here, we're actually witnessing a sort of contention between the Duke of Burgundy and King Philip, who, despite King Philip being the king, if King Philip were to make too many decisions like this, to let prisoners go without ransoming it, it's likely he would have been seen as weak. This would have been bad for the sort of like royal coffers. But at the end of the day, despite very important custom of ransoming knights off, there are still situations where, at least right here, King Philip is arguing it's better not to. Part of what I think this is likely about, I don't really know where Audenard is geographically, but especially if King Philip ends up saying is that he never wanted to do homage to the King of England, but that's who his lord was. And so King Philip here is deciding not to hold Arnul accountable for loyalty he has to the people that he serves. Which, in that case, why are you holding the rest of your prisoners hostage? What I think is, I don't know exactly what the connection between the Count of Soissons and the king is, but the other thing to keep in mind here is that if King Philip is considering expanding the French state, and if Audenard is within that sort of realm, it's going to be a lot more easy for King Philip to, have an alliance with Arnul in the future if he treats these people well, So I think that's another thing to kind of consider is, as much as ransoming certainly was very customary, and, 9 times out of 10, you probably capture a knight and you ransom him off back to his kingdom. There are certain situations where there might be a kind of diplomacy in not making someone pay for their own relative after warfare. So just a cute little thing King Philip did. All right, it's like they say, don't be sad it's over, be happy it happened, Be happy it happened. Be happy that we're here, be happy that I know you're all pretty upset that we're dealing with our last 2 quotes and the whole thing's coming to a close, but such is life. Such is life. All right, so here we go. Quote 11. What more can I tell you? It was a marvel that the number of barons, bachelors, sergeants taken was so great. They were pursued over 2 miles of land. The emperor took flight toward Valenciennes and spent the night at the Abbey of Saint Sage, and the others ran away to various places as best as thoroughly vanquished people could. One of the main reasons I included this quote was because I find it interesting that on more than one occasion, even in this small little passages, like the author says, "What more can I tell you?" twice. You tell me. You're the one. You're the one who's still writing, you goofy boy. And then obviously, I think the other beyond that. There's an amplification, I think, to the importance and significance of this ransom, custom, in that the author again notes that the amount of people that Philip was able to capture was actually a marvel. He describes it as a marvel, right? A word that, I reserve exclusively to talk about toast. He describes to talk about how many men were captured by King Philip. So it's very impressive, very impressive. Again, we have the mentioning of miles, which I don't understand. I'll look into that. I'm going to look into that for you. We're going to figure out what's going on with Anonymous of Bouvines talking about miles. Are you American? Is the Anonymous of Bouvines possibly American? Nice little fun conspiracy theory that definitely holds no water, but hopefully catches. Hopefully. Yep, and similar to the Marchiennes account, we have the Emperor taking flight, right? Running away to Valenciennes, going to an abbey. Must be fun. The Abbey of Saint Sage, which sounds like Otto was neither saintly nor particularly sage. And then, yeah, everyone else running away to all the places that vanquished people go, I guess, which luckily I don't know because I'm not very vanquished, but I guess exist. So, but yeah, this kind of is about the defeat of, what happened after the defeat anyway of the Flemings and how the Emperor ran away, and it sounds like it was pretty disorderly in regards to, there was no rendezvous point after you lost the Battle of Bouvines, which, yeah, I guess no one suspects. No one intends to lose the Battle of Bouvines, so they all ran away to wherever they did. Lord knows. We know the Emperor went to Valenciennes at the Abbey of Saint Sage. We don't know where anyone else went. And then here we go. Quote 12. Quote 12. After this, no one dare wage war against him, and he lived in great peace, and the whole of the land was in great peace for a long time to come, so that his bailiffs could exact much on his sons' bailiffs, even more from all the land he had come to hold. It was one of his sergeants called Nevelon, who was bailiff of Arras, who put into such servitude the whole of Flanders inherited by Louis, that all those who heard about it marveled that one could suffer so and endure. So, yeah. This is obviously... So the first part that we need to talk about is the Battle of Bouvines obviously ends up, according to this perspective, creating an era of peace and prosperity for the French kingdom, which... the losing the Battle of Bouvines did the exact opposite for King John, who, as a result of so many people getting captured, needed to pay King Philip for all these people, and ultimately a bunch of this land comes to be owned by King Philip, and I don't know necessarily how all of that land traded place. So hopefully we can get into that a little bit in another episode if I can figure out how to find sources for this land transfer, because I think that's kind of what the second half of the passage is talking about. All the wealth he's able to exact from the land that he had come to hold after this conflict, and how it then got transferred down to Louis, his son. So... not only did this battle secure sort of peace and prosperity for the French people at the time, this quote doesn't necessarily mention the civil war that this would cause in England, but it very much does. So, within that, I think it's just interesting to look at, how much was riding on at least this particular battle, right? This is a battle that I, by and large, had no idea even happened for the majority of my life. I'd say until about a month and a half ago. And now it's all that I talk about. All I talk about is the Battle of Bouvines and its significance. And I think, it's really, this is definitely one of the bigger reasons why the English barons end up really becoming very rebellious by 1215. It's, I think that this ends up creating a lot of pressure for King John ultimately to sign the Magna Carta, and I think the importance of the account of Bouvines, the account of Anonymous de Bethunes, is really understanding why this battle resulted in such a boonfall, in such a, win for King Philip, and why it was so detrimental to English morale and the, kind of reputation that King John had as a ruler at that point in time. So, yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for watching, especially if you made it to the end of this episode. Obviously, more than worth it. Medieval Monday, everyone's favorite show. Yeah, if you liked it, if you enjoyed watching it, please like, subscribe. If you know anything I got wrong, let me know. And if you're sick and tired of hearing about the Battle of Bouvines, I'm sorry. There are like 4 more accounts that we could go through. And, unless you have something, if you have something you'd like for me to talk about, let me know. I'll look into it. We can see if we can find a primary source about it. But for now, expect another account of the Battle of Bouvines for next week. So thank you so much for watching Medieval Monday. What more can I tell you? Go home. Have a good day, everyone.